the world was shaped by the printing press more than what was printed on it. The world was shaped by the telegraph and the telephone, more by the news that was transmitted or the conversations which happened. And down the line, it's the medium in that it's the new environment, the new circumstances introduced by a technology that reshape us individually and socially. And the interesting thing to me and why I am actually hopeful rather than I have a mix of hope and pessimism at times. It depends when you reach me, maybe. But I have hope because when Marshall first said the medium is the message in 1958, and probably from his entire lifetime, people thought he was crazy. What are you even talking about? The message is the message. But I can have a conversation like this with you or your students or anybody else and say what I just said, that the form shapes us more than the content does. Not that the content doesn't matter. Like nobody ever says that. It's not true. But in terms of impact, it's when you start to look at it, it's quite obvious that the greater impact comes from the form, from the environment, from the structure, than from its content. In fact, looking at the content tends to distract us from the form and the structure and the environment as a shaping force.
Sometimes people think of others' intellectual capacity because of their degrees or academic success and so forth, other things, authorship and those things. I have plenty of degrees and I am technically an author, but I do not consider myself an intellectual heavyweight. I have a few friends. Not all of my friends I would put in that category, but today's guest, Andrew McLuhan, is definitely an intellectual heavyweight. And the name McLuhan may conjure up for many of you Marshall McLuhan, which is indeed Andrew's grandfather. And Andrew has taken on the great privilege and also the challenge of continuing to keep his grandfather's work and his father's work, Eric, alive with the McLuhan Institute. And although Andrew considers himself a poet, he's a poet, and he doesn't necessarily have the specific lens that his grandfather has. He is continuing that really important and thoughtful work around media. And again, if I'm saying these things and you don't know who Marshall McLuhan is, you may want to pause and go and do a little searching and discover who Marshall McLuhan was and how his work from the 50s, 60s, and 70s remains seminal to today's world. And that is something I've always been so fascinated by, is how has history led us to this, not just led us to this moment, but that there were people who could see how the world might unfold as we continue a trajectory with technology. And we get into so many really great discussions around what even technology is and how we've narrowed the definition of that and how expanding that definition helps us understand our world so much differently. And so many just juicy nuggets here from Andrew. And I'm so grateful to have met him. I had him do one of my classes this fall, introduced him to my students, and I continue to follow his work and just really admire him for continuing to share the mission that his father had around how do we understanding media is really critical to understanding ourselves and the world we live in. An intellectual heavyweight, absolutely. So great for Andrew and his time, and I hope you enjoy our conversation today with Andrew McLuhan. Andrew, not only are you wearing a University of Manitoba hoodie, that just confuses the issue more in terms of all of the spaces and places where you are currently teaching and educating. Can you just provide a little bit of a synopsis of what Andrew McLuhan is doing this fall 2024?
I'm happy to. Yeah, so I have a habit that when I go to a university or college to give a lecture or teach a class or whatever, I like to get a hoodie from the campus store. So it's a way of remembering where I was, what I've been doing. And,
Seems like a lot of hoodies.
it is a lot of hoodies, but hey, it's cold out here.
Sure.
So I can always use a good hoodie. Yeah, it's where am I teaching? I do most of my teaching is unfortunately online. It's not my favorite thing to do, but I can't be everywhere every time. I think it's better than not doing it most times. Yeah, so I do a lot of virtual teaching, guest lectures and classes. I do a bunch of in person as well, and that can be anything from a one-off introduction to McLuhan, or it can be a series or something deeper. It really depends on the class, and it runs. I haven't done any young stuff lately, but I do classes for grade 4 up through undergrad, graduate, university, and then I do a fair amount of independent stuff. Like my grandfather, I realized that the world is larger than the classroom. The world is the classroom. So I teach through an organization in San Francisco called Gray Area, and they do a lot of arts and technology programming. And they host my Understanding Media class, which is in total 36 3-hour classes to go through the book word by word, cover to cover, which takes a particularly devoted person to be interested in. We break it up into 3 kind of semesters, and we're about to start 2nd semester, I think in January. And I also do some private stuff, less public stuff. Another thing I'm doing this fall is I'm teaming up with Matt Klein. He's head of, what is it, strategy and future or something at Reddit, and runs a thing called Zine, and together we're leading another kind of understanding media seminar where the first time we did it, we did a super condensed version of part 1 of understanding media. And this time we're going to do 3 next level classes, one on figure and ground, one on some other key ideas, and one on the laws of media or the tetrad. Yeah, the nature of being independent, self-employed, not affiliated with an institution is that you get the work where you get it, and that happens to be all over the place.
Right. Yeah. And again, you were gracious enough to spend some time at the University of Regina
Yeah.
last week with my class, which I so appreciated. So, for those, whether they're super familiar with McLuhan's work or not, can you just give us the condensed version of the history of your grandfather, his work, and then how that's led to you today?
Yeah. I still find it myself a really fascinating story because it's so unexpected. All parts of art are expected from my grandfather, who started out in mechanical engineering, went into English literature, ended up also getting interested in communications, and then being one of the main founders of media studies. To myself, the 3rd generation, so skipped a generation, might not exactly skipped, but my father worked very closely with his father, Marshall. I think it's very unusual that I'm actually sitting here right now talking to you about this. I haven't dug too deeply, but I don't think there are many examples of a 3rd generation doing something like this. So it's a little unusual and maybe surprising. It surprises me, frankly. My own background is in poetry and punk rock, and I didn't get interested in this family stuff until I was into my 30s. But once I did start to get interested, I became unavoidably interested in that. It's the kind of thing that I just couldn't let go. And luckily, I have a very supportive wife who agreed that I needed to figure it out. And back around 2017, 2018, I decided, since there was no McLuhan Institute, I'd start it and see if I could make it work. And if I could, then great. And if I couldn't, then hey, I gave it a shot. And I don't have retirement plans, but it's going okay.
So, I guess I'm curious. A couple things strike me. One is I think there's a natural tendency for all of us seems like particularly with men as they get older, just revisit this interest in history, right? Like when you're younger, it's, that's whatever. Most of us don't have that. And then there's something about, I don't know at what age, where we get more and more curious about, wait a minute, where did I come from? How did it get here? Like
Mhm.
move pretty quickly at those young stages, but once at some point. So that's fascinating. But the other thing I was wondering that I thought about as you were sharing that is, so you start this McLuhan Institute not that many years ago. How do you find most people, like you said, you're teaching this course right now and you're sharing all the time. How do you think most people come to find McLuhan in 2024? Like how are they getting to you?
I think those are a few separate questions. There's how people are finding McLuhan, and then there's how people are finding me.
Okay.
I think the first hurdle is finding McLuhan. Once you've found McLuhan and you're looking, I'm pretty easy to find
Right.
because I've I've worked pretty hard the last 10 years or so to build a profile so that when people search McLuhan, they find the McLuhan Institute, they find me. I guess I've made a pain of myself in being visible and discoverable on the internet through Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, mainly Twitter, actually.
Hmm.
Uh, Twitter has a surprising reach. The difficulty with the internet is that anybody can put stuff on there, but how do you find anything? How do you stand out? And I haven't done any kind of search engine optimization or anything like that. I think I've just put myself out there a lot. And so people can find me. And it's led to interesting things. Actually, we come together through a real life connection, which is great. Um, Shout out to our mutual friend, but um, mainly, interestingly, a lot of it is ephemeral, digital, shrinking degrees of separation, which is really cool. But how people find McLuhan in the first place these days?
I think how and why, I think maybe too.
Yeah,
Why are they even looking?
I think there is an increasing desire to understand what's going on. You know, we live in a time when as humans, we've created technologies and powerful technologies for millennia. But what's changed is scale and pace, particularly in the last few hundred years. The separation between innovation and effect has steadily shrunk. Hundreds of years ago, before telegraph, it took time for a new technology to catch on. Years, right? It took a century before the printing press was global. Now, a new technology like ChatGPT or Sora or any of these things can go global in a matter of hours, not even days. And when things happen slowly, we don't tend to take note of them very much. And we also have an ability to adjust, a greater ability to adjust. When things happen faster and at an increasing rate, we don't have that luxury of time to adjust. So we feel it a lot more. We can't. And I think because of that, we have an increased need, if not desire, to figure it out a little more. And my grandfather was one of the pioneers in starting to look at that and not just look at it for his curiosity's sake, but to develop ways for us to understand technologies going forward. And I don't think you have to understand everything about it to understand there's something to it. And I think this is what brings people to McLuhan. It's this guy obviously knew what was going on. What's up with that? And I think that brings a lot of people my way.
Well, and he knew what was going on, and in hindsight, we can see, oh, he knew what was coming too, that he was predicting in some ways in those early stages of media or of the technologies that we have now with television and computers at the time, very insightful. There were other people at the time who probably didn't correctly predict, and those people don't quite have the same traction in terms of our interest. I wonder, what would you say what do you think your grandfather would have been like maybe something specific that he saw coming in terms of the way the internet worked and so forth, but maybe even something that you think he might be surprised with that maybe either didn't fully align with his perspective or just was more impactful than he could have even imagined?
He liked to play with words and play with ideas, and I suppose play with people a little bit. Um, he, I think he understood that a lot of the world was really, he called them somnambulists, kind of sleepwalkers. See, he said that understanding is a generation behind invention. There's a big
Mhm.
lag there. And he liked to be provocative because he said there's no other way to get attention than to be controversial. Simply, people won't pay attention. So he would say deliberately provocative things, but he was usually being quite serious. For example, he said, I'm very careful to only predict things which have already happened. And this is, if you put these two ideas together, you see why a lot of his predictions have come true because he was seeing his present, which we're only really seeing 30, 40, 50, 60 years
Right.
later. Sure, it seems like he was predicting the future, but really we're just catching up to what he was seeing around him. And that's actually a disturbing thought, or it should be, because if what we're looking at is really 20 to 60 years ago, what aren't we seeing today? And that really should disturb us. But did even though he insisted that he wasn't predicting anything, he did make some predictions. But they're predictions of the sort that are not really made up out of whole cloth. As if you see waves coming to shore, if you see a big wave in the distance, as you can understand that's going to get here. And his work in understanding media, for example, was really a story about a great transition in technology from the age of mechanism to the age of electronics, digital being a part of that as well. And so a lot of what he predicted was just how far the electric revolution would go. It's really interesting to me to note that the electric or electronic revolution doesn't seem to be quite done. We keep electrifying things, including now cigarettes, right? E cigarettes, which is pretty funny, and cars. It's remarkable to me that we're only getting around to doing cars
Mm.
at this point. And I think that's something that would surprise him. I think pardon
That
me,
it took
I think
that long?
yeah, I think it would surprise him that, it's taken this long to get to some of these things, although it might not necessarily surprise him because, the main thing holding this sort of transition up is vested interests, and there's some pretty big vested interests in the way of electrifying cars, for example.
And now potentially airplanes, which they talk about,
Oh god, really?
which is wild. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That yeah. But it's part of it is I always feel like we were promised flying cars like when in the '70s, like we thought. And so in
Well,
some ways, there are things that I think when you hear people's predictions of 2020 or 2030s, these kind of things, especially if you go back 30 years, we'd all been wearing spacesuits and all of this kind of Star Trekky kind of
well,
vision, which there are some of those things are true, right? Maybe
and
not.
actually, this is something else that my grandfather talked about a bit, and I think he would be surprised at, is he liked to call his approach or his theory a transformation theory versus a transportation theory. That people in the early 20th century, like Shannon and Weaver, who created this communication model was all about transportation, about sending a message from a source to a receiver, right? With minimal interruption along the way. Transportation, getting something from one place to another, a message in this case. And Marshall called his theory a transformation theory, or what the effect is on humans in rearranging them personally and socially. And he thought that the transportation model was more in line with the age of the alphabet and mechanism, linear things, and that the transformation model, which is more in line with electricity, instantaneity, resonance, this kind of thing, would lead to different ideas of not just communication, but transportation. that according to quantum physics and everything else, there's really no reason to fly or drive anywhere when here I am in Regina right now. Why haven't we figured out how to do this for people instead of just our images?
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. We're not there yet.
No. One of the things too that you introduced me to is, and I'd like to maybe just share a little bit more about this difference between media literacy and media ecology
Right.
and why that, because that's media literacy. That's the language that we use in our schools and we work with teachers. But talk a little bit about the difference between that and media ecology and why that's an important thing to understand.
Sure. Yeah, they're related but separate disciplines. And of course, they're more categories than anything else because I'm sure if you interview 10 people about media literacy, you'll probably get 10 different answers as to what it is. Because you have media literacy, you have media and information literacy, you have digital media literacy. There's all kinds of media literacies. But I think they boil down to a similar thing, which is, and of course, this is coming from more of a media ecology lens, but I see media literacy as more focusing on content, effective content, the nature of content. Media literacy wants you to understand that the people behind these technologies or pieces of content have agendas and biases, which are baked into the content or medium or technology. And it's about education, literacy, and understanding that thing to be able to be a more informed or better user, right? Media ecology, and again, there are, I think, different media ecologies. For example, Marshall McLuhan, there's a McLuhan media ecology, and then there's Neil Postman media ecology, and they're different in approach. For example, Postman said that he doesn't see any point in studying technology except from a moral point of view. And McLuhan says pretty much the opposite. He says that a moral point of view quickly cuts you off from understanding the nature of a thing, right? Once you decide whether this is a good or a bad thing, you really close off a lot of your ability to understand what it is and what it does. But ecology, from the McLuhan standpoint anyway, also implies action, not just understanding. Because if you think about natural ecology, there's not much point in simply discovering that there's a pollutant in the environment, but you want to do something about it to restore or introduce some kind of balance. And the idea of media ecology from my family's point of view is in line with that. It's not just study or theory, it's about action. And I think those are fundamentally different, but also related approaches.
So, what would you say then would be one of the most important sort of lessons or concepts that we should be paying attention to here in 2024 based on your family's work and seeing what we see today with a rather, you think about, I don't know, the way we perceived the internet, the launch of the internet. There was a lot, and while there's always been concern about a new media, there seemed to be a lot more optimism and potential. And here we are in 2024, and I don't know if it is related to our political climate, polarization, and all. We've seen that emerge as not solely, but highly influenced and occurring because of the technologies. What would you just say would be a key lesson that the McLuhans have seen and talked about that we need to be applying and thinking through in today's
Yeah.
world?
A lot of my work is focused on this phrase, the medium is the message. I think it's the basic unit of understanding as far as media ecology and really media literacy, any kind of media study goes, is that people have always been changed more by the nature of the form than by the content of it. The world was shaped by the printing press more than what was printed on it. The world was shaped by the telegraph and the telephone more by the news that was transmitted or the conversations which happened. And down the line, it's the medium in that it's the new environment, the new circumstances introduced by a technology that reshape us individually and socially. And the interesting thing to me, and why I am actually hopeful rather than I have a mix of hope and pessimism at times. It depends when you reach me, maybe. But I have hope because when Marshall first said the medium is the message in 1958, and probably from his entire lifetime, people thought he was crazy. What are you even talking about? The message is the message. But I can have a conversation like this with you or your students or anybody else and say what I just said, that the form shapes us more than the content does. Not that the content doesn't matter. Like nobody ever says that. It's not true. But in terms of impact, it's when you start to look at it, it's quite obvious that the greater impact comes from the form, from the environment, from the structure, than from its content. In fact, looking at the content tends to distract us from the form and the structure and the environment as a shaping force. But what gives me hope is that I can explain this like I just did, and people will just nod along and is, yeah, no, obviously. And that is a big change in the decades since that
Right.
first was uttered. What gives me the pessimism about that and takes away the hope a little bit is that 1960, 65 years later, even though this is obvious, we really haven't changed our habits very much. We understand that the greatest effects from a new technology is going to come from its introduction in the world that it changes and us as we change, not from the content. But that has not changed our habits at all. It doesn't seem to have changed how we design technology. It hasn't led to any meaningful attempt at regulation. And it doesn't even seem to have affected the way that we as individuals generally buy and use technologies. So that can get you down after a little while. But I really believe that another thing that gives me hope is that humans have this incredible capacity to overcome any challenge that comes before us. We need a certain amount of motivation and we'll find a way. And that gives me hope because I think if we can collectively decide to do better, we'll do better.
Yeah. And as you make those statements, and I think about examples, like for example, you talk about the printing press and how it changed us. And I remember hearing somebody say that people are lamenting today, oh, we have a sort of a loss of community. But the book was really the first way in which we lost community because no longer did we have to go to whether it was the church or a scholar to sit and listen to somebody else. We could have our own information in our hands and consume information on our own, which obviously was amazing. And we all, to this day, we don't see it in that light because we revere the book as being almost a highly, a more moral medium, if moral is the right word, but certainly a higher, we value it more in terms of we think this is, if you're reading a book, you are just by generally a better person. And yeah, and there's probably lots. And then when I think about your grandfather talking about the impact of television, I didn't have a lot in you, maybe you didn't either as a kid, a lot of, I don't know, start you, maybe for you, but there was never like, oh, you're watching too much television because there was only limited amounts of television. And so you watch what you watch. And then screen time became a thing. And now, of course, we see with the evolution of technologies, like we're, to your point, that we're recognizing today that, wait, there's an addictive quality to this. The medium itself is challenging to us, never mind the messaging. So we're getting to that point. But I do wonder about what your grandfather might have said about the increasing amount of addictive and intentional desires of the developers of these technologies to keep you, because it's just all related to the amount of money that's now
R-
a part of these
r-
technologies that is driving them to become more and more addictive. And we are challenged to take this perspective and understanding that your grandfather started with about the medium. I just wonder if what he might have said or has said with regards to the increasing addictiveness of these technologies.
At the heart of it, one of his main theses, the subtitle of Understanding Media is The Extensions of Man. He saw all human technologies as amplifications or extensions of some physical or sensorial, some part of ourselves. We create a new technology to do something we already do a little bit better or faster or more efficient, right? And this is the case for everything from cutlery, knives and forks and cups and spoons to communication technology like telephones and computers. They're all amplifications. So, as such, we're addicted, you might say, to the use of our faculties. I'm addicted to being able to type with 8 fingers and 2 thumbs, right? It's natural that I'm in the habit of having conversations and using language, a technology. There's an addictive part of any of our technologies just because they are part of us and they become part of us. However, especially in more recent times, some of the people developing technologies, and maybe this comes to the media literacy side of things a bit, go out of their way to make them even more addictive, right? Let's amp this up. And that's because the marketing people or the return on investment people get involved and say, hey, this is great. Can we do better? Uh, I have moral, ethical issues with that personally. I don't think that's right. But people engaged in this kind of behavior might wanna rethink what they're doing because, for example, the tobacco companies are reaping the rewards of adding addictiveness to their products. Eventually, you'll probably end up paying for it. It's probably in the long run not worth the short-term gains, and it's also I don't even think it's ethically ambiguous. I think pretty much most people will agree it's not a great thing to do. But this was something that actually Marshall McLuhan talked about. I'm not sure. I think I may have mentioned it in your class in his preface to The Mechanical Bride, talking about advertising, which is a relatively new discipline. If you look at the history of humanity, advertising's been around for less than 200 years, really, as we know it. And in 51, Marshall wrote that ours is the first age in which many thousands of the best trained minds have been turned to get inside the public mind. And critically, he added, to get inside to generate heat, not light, is the object. In other words, to get you to buy stuff, not necessarily to get you to understand anything better about the world. But yeah, I can't exactly say what he would say about the state of things. He was always very careful to not take a moral position when talking about technology because he understood that how quickly that gets in the way of understanding. He also said that it's really impossible to take a moral or ethical position until you understand things completely. And we don't understand things completely. Also, the moral and the ethics are very positional. We Today's technology is tomorrow's values. And it would do well to keep that in mind because one culture values one thing that another does not. And that has a lot to do with technology and how we're shaped.
Yeah, and I think to your earlier point of today, the fact that people are wanting to understand McLuhan's ideas and how that influences today tells me that there's a desire for us to, and it's not that we won't be shaped by our tools, we will, but in more of a greater awareness of what's happening to us so that the choices we make are our own choices and not just being succumbing to the technologies as they come at us and have no agency to be able to decide and then make those moral decisions and ethical decisions, which I think is a really, I'm so glad that you shared that distinction because I think we're in a world today where we're always forced to choose a side, pick a side. And that becomes that just not only does that add to the polarization, but also to your point is it makes it more difficult for us to understand what's going on when we have it's like being a referee and I'm a Leafs fan, but I'm going to referee this game. You're not going to be probably a very good referee if you already have a bias going into it. So I so appreciate that. And again, last question about specifically about the McLuhan Institute and things. So what would you recommend would be, let's identify two groups here. Let's identify the group that really says, I maybe have heard of Marshall McLuhan, but I don't really know much about what would be their starting point for those folks. And for those that have a little bit more of an understanding, but you want to maybe challenge them and say, this might be something to consume. Can you give us a couple of recommendations of resources that for those two groups of people?
Sure. There it depends. It really depends on the person because a lot of people have a hard time reading, have a hard time with print. Not that they're illiterate or unable to actually read, but enjoying reading takes a lot of effort and work. And a lot of people haven't put that work in or have let that work slide. And reading is a chore, is a difficult way of getting information. People who are into reading, it's great to start with this book, The Medium is the Massage, 1967. It's a bit of a hybrid. It's an early kind of graphic print hybrid collaboration with Quentin Fiore. It's a great beginner in to McLuhan stuff. As is, he gave an interview with Playboy magazine in 1969, March of 1969, which is a fantastic read, but it's very dense, difficult reading. But YouTube is your friend. There is a ton of McLuhan content, if you want to put it that way, on YouTube. Lectures that he gave, interviews that he gave, panels he was on. It's a lot of fun. One of my favorites to watch is he did a panel with Norman Mailer. It's billed as a debate, but it's a lot of fun to watch. Norman Mailer and Marshall McLuhan go back and forth. McLuhan is great. It's also really interesting to see how he presents himself across these different media. Because remember, he had a very sophisticated understanding of the different biases of different media. So you'll get a different McLuhan in audio that you'll get in audio video that you'll get in print. And he was very aware of it. And you can watch even two different appearances. Watch the Norman Mailer debate and watch, he did an interview with Mike McManus, who I think recently passed away. It's interesting if you're able to step back a little bit and try and observe the dynamics or what's going on aside from what's being said. Marshall McLuhan was a master of style and presentation, and you can see he had a lot of fun doing it. So those are some, I think, easiest ways to get into it, but he challenges you to meet him. You have to work to really get it. And people aren't used to that today. A lot of nonfiction is presented, I'm not going to say simplistically, but an effort is made to, as they say, reduce friction. And Marshall actually went the other way. He introduces friction as a way of getting people involved and invested. You got to work to get the understanding, but then you get the understanding. And it's all the better for having won it yourself.
That was a great description of that. And again, I'm always fascinated by people who will create a little cognitive dissonance for me to go, wait a minute. Because I feel like that's the best way to learn. Like when it's too easy, sometimes it's not, just didn't feel right. I know,
Yeah.
because I know this inherently is complex and challenging. So I should feel that sometimes along the journey. So this podcast has leadership in the title, and I'm not sure how you view that. Again, that word can be interpreted in a lot of ways, but I'm always curious to see if you can think about what you might consider a leadership challenge that you've had in the past and how you've navigated that, or maybe you're having it right now. I don't know. But just I like to talk about those challenges and just get your insights on how you've dealt with that.
I'm not sure I'm a very good leader, to tell you the truth. It's leadership is probably one of my big challenges in that the McLuhan Institute is a one-man show. It's one person. It's me. But I do have a lot of people around me who really I had somebody get in touch this past week, who, is a PhD student and they would love to help out and do something. and I'm not great at giving people ways to help me. And part of that is just a lack of experience. I've worked on my own for so long, haven't really taken any leadership roles anywhere, managerial roles. Another is that, to tell you the truth, I have a lot of fun doing this stuff and I don't want to give it to anybody else. However, that said, as a consequence of maturing, let's say getting older, if you want to put it another way, I realize that there's more work to do than I can do in my lifetime. Really, I need to change the way I do things because I can't do it all. So maybe my prerogative going forward is, or my mandate is to figure out what I'm best at, what I can maybe reasonably accomplish in the time I have left, all things considered, and what maybe I can let some other people do. So yeah, I guess I'm going through a leadership
Yeah.
crisis at the moment.
And listen, that for anybody in leadership, whether you officially have dozens, hundreds of people to report to you, whatever, I think what you're sharing is a pretty common challenge that people find things they like to do. And then at some point, as your job expands and you're recognizing, okay, there's more work to do. I can't do all the things that I used to do. And what would that look like to delegate, whether it's delegation or just passing off to somebody else, and then with how they do it. And the example of that I give is, so I don't know how things work in your household, but in my household, I'm an employee of my wife who runs the house. She is clearly the manager, the whatever. And so she gives me tasks to do that she can't do, but probably would prefer if she could do it because she doesn't trust me to do it. But then she struggles with how well or poorly I am at the task. That's not how she would have done it. And I'm trying to explain to her, listen, you gave me the job. I'm doing the best that I can. It's not up to your standard. We have to have a conversation. So I
Yeah,
live in that space all the time.
that's the thing. The thing is, I recognize that I have things that I'm disposed toward, strengths, if you will,
Yeah.
and things that I'm less great at. And I'm very fortunate in my life partnership situation that my wife is great at things that I'm not great at.
Yeah.
However, the hitch there is that she isn't necessarily more interested in doing those things. There's,
Yes,
uh,
there are those tasks where she just says, "Listen, I don't want anything to do with it. You just go ahead." But again, back to
yeah,
your current dilemma is, I guess, identifying those things which maybe you haven't been doing that you should be doing,
yeah.
but because you're focusing on those strengths, maybe somebody else would do this and pick up the slack in an area where I'm not. That's just part of self awareness and part of your own personal growth and learning that. But it's
Sure.
those aren't easy tasks.
And you know what? All of these problems will be solved when I win the lottery or when my book gets finished and I make $10 million on it and can just hire out the help.
You go.
Soon.
Yeah. So I always ask this question too. I'm a big believer in gratitude. I'd love you to name a person in education, preferably living, preferably somebody that could maybe hear this, that you are grateful for. Could it some unsung hero along the way that you say, boy, that person, I want to shout them out for how they've helped me.
Wow. You know what? Having seen a bit of the other side of the desk as far as teaching goes, I've learned a lot and learned to be forgiving because I understand it's a real tough gig. I've had a few very important teachers in my life, not always for the best reasons. I had one teacher that just about killed poetry for me, but I eventually learned very great lessons from her, so it's hard to be mad. I'm really fortunate to be surrounded by, there's lessons and teachers everywhere, and I'm not sure it has to be as formal as it seems. I'm not trying to take an easy way out from an answer here. So let me name a name or two. One, our mutual friend Jason, we have a mutual friend, BW Powell. He's really been an inspiration as I've watched gotten to know how he's navigated institutional things and life passion things and make it all work. I think he's a shining example for one. It's really hard to put names. One who's not around. I'll name one who I'm really grateful for who's not around anymore. Other than saying the easy thing like my father or my grandfather who've taught me so much. Um, There's a guy who was president of the University of Toronto. He's been passed away a few years now, but Claude Bissell was a legendary president of the University of Toronto, and he was a very strong supporter of my grandfather's and made it possible for him to remain at the University of Toronto in Toronto for all those years. And that's important. It's important to me personally because it probably has a lot to do with where I was born and raised. But I think it also has a lot to do with what my grandfather was able to accomplish in his lifetime. Uh, At the height of his fame, Marshall was given a lot of offers of where he could have gone to teach. Um, and luckily, U of T made it attractive enough for him to stay in Toronto. And Marshall valued the fact that he wasn't as valued at home as he was in other places because it meant that he could get stuff done. If he had been at MIT or God, wherever else and had a more quote unquote important position, he might have been too busy to do a lot of the work that he did. He was busy anyway, but shout out to Claude Bissell for being in McLuhan's corner all those years.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. About both good ones. All right. 3 kind of rapid fire-ish questions to
All right.
close. First one is, what are you reading right now?
Oh, as a matter of fact, I do a weekly radio program here called The Spoken Word. It's on FM radio, 99.3 County FM. And last night I was reading Robert Louis Steven, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that's one thing I'm reading. Another thing I'm reading is T.S. Eliot's collection, The Sacred Wood. And then for fun, I'm reading there's a series by Preston Child called the Pendergast series of mystery novels, and I'm reading one of those.
All right. So when you're not reading and trying to wrestle with these pretty large intellectual problems, challenges, and teaching, what are you watching? You got any? And it could be. I know you're a Leafs fan, but I don't know. Do you have any like really trashy, garbagey, bingey shows that you watch too? You can say that here. It's a safe space.
I don't really watch shows so much. My wife likes the trashy social media shows. What I actually like, this may or may not surprise you, but I'm a product of my time and place, and I'm super into hip hop. And I watch a lot of hip hop stuff,
Like
freestyles,
documentaries and stuff like that.
like performances,
Performances. All right.
freestyles, concerts, and interviews. Yeah.
Cool.
Shout out. Yeah. Speaking of educators, shout out to Nardwar, the human serviette, one of the greatest unsung Canadian heroes currently living. What this guy has done is doing for our country and hip hop and punk rock culture is incredible.
Okay. There we go. Last one. You are in. I believe you said you're in Prince Edward County. Is that correct? Visitors to that area. It's a beautiful part of Ontario for sure. Give us a lesser known place that people should check out in and around where you live.
Sure. When I'm not generally working, I'm a hockey dad. And I have a lot of fun actually going to hockey games. We have 2 major arenas here in Picton and Wellington, and anybody can go in there and watch a minor hockey game, usually for free. It's a big part of our culture, and I highly recommend it.
Okay. Andrew, this has been great. I so appreciate your time, and you're reviving my own interest in McLuhan and others, and I think it's such a timely thing for people. So I'm hoping that this will also inspire those who listen to say, yes, I got to revisit or engage for the first time in this stuff. So thank you for all you're doing, and thanks for your time today.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.